Welcome to this edition of American Purpose. My name is Jack Moline. I am president of Interfaith Alliance. 60 years ago, Henry Luce, publisher of Life magazine, invited 10 prominent men, each to compose an essay on the national purpose. Then, as now, there was a sense that we stood at the beginning of a time of cultural and political change. Our project expands on this work as each episode explores one perspective on where our nation was, where it is, and where it should be heading with a contemporary thought leader. My guests are from the worlds of faith, government, politics, and culture, and they have generously agreed to share their time with us. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and our mission to protect your faith and freedom at interfaithalliance.org and by listening to our radio program and podcast, State of Belief, at stateofbelief.com. But right now, let's find out more about the American purpose with my guest, Rabbi Rachel Ain. Rabbi Ain is the rabbi at Sutton Place Synagogue in New York and a renowned spokesperson for the Jewish community, not just in New York, but on national television and other outlets as well. Welcome, Rachel, to American Purpose.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So let me start by asking you, in your opinion, what was the original national purpose of the United States?
So for me, the original national purpose of the United States, certainly a narrative that has been integrated into who I am in my education, was as Americans, it was to throw off the tyranny of what came before and to create a free society where people of all different backgrounds could live together. I say that noting the irony that I believe that's the purpose of what we were founded on and founded for, but we know that it's taken hundreds of years to get to where we want to be.
Is it your sense that our founders had in their minds as expansive a notion of equality as you perceive it from your 21st century perspective?
I doubt it, but I don't know that they did that deliberately. I'd like to give them some credit that just as for all of us, we have grown and we've evolved over the past months, years, decades, trying to understand what freedom truly means and what it means to be an American. When those men founded our country, they were not old men looking back on decades of leading a country. They were trying to become free. They were trying to build a more perfect union, not yet having the 2020 hindsight to know where they might go wrong.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes funny for us to think about the people who built this country were considerably younger than even we are now, and yet they were creating this massive experiment. So having said that, what do you believe is or ought to be the American purpose going forward?
So I actually believe the purpose is the same: to have a country filled with people who are not living under just one ruler, but rather it's a conglomerate of people living together who can articulate different ideas and ideals. I don't think that has changed, but we need to know that when the phrase all men were created equal over 2 centuries ago, we need to understand that what they meant by that then is not enough. We need to go deeper. It can't just be about men. It needs to be about men and women. It can't just be about white people. It needs to be about people of all races and creeds and backgrounds. But the notion of equality as a fundamental value of our American society is something that I still hold on to and I don't want to give up on. And I'm willing to look critically at the founding of our country and still celebrate what it means to be an American.
It's great. Our country rests on foundational values. You've talked about some of them. Some of them are admirable and some of them a little less so. What are one or two of the values that we have as a legacy of being Americans that are worth doubling down on in this day and age?
So, one is the notion of the American dream of the immigrant experience. The idea that when you look at the Statue of Liberty and you read the words of Emma Lazarus's poem, that we all have come here from somewhere else, and that we all bring our expertise to build the country that we believe it can be built for. And I don't want to give that up. I know there's lots of complications around how we understand who an immigrant is and how they come here and what the path to citizenship is. Those are important conversations, but the notion of we are a nation of immigrants is something I do want to hold on to. I want us to remember that. The value that I've been challenged by lately is the idea that when the immigrants come here, the myth that the streets are paved with gold and all you need to do is work hard and you'll be successful. I think that that was a value that I was taught. I am not a child of immigrants. In fact, my grandparents were all born in this country, and even some of my great-grandparents were born in this country. But they, too, came from somewhere else. And the idea was that in each generation, they worked hard, and I've been able to benefit from the fruits of their labor, and I continue to work hard. What I didn't understand until much more recently was that there were systemic barriers to so many people where they live, the education they didn't receive, the conversations they didn't have access to, which it didn't matter how hard they worked, how much they desired to achieve the American dream. Somebody was standing on their back.
So I want to take a slight detour from what we've talked about and what I warned you we were going to talk about, because you've said something very interesting here about your family's longevity in this country. I'm significantly older than you are, but my family as well has been in America for a lot of years. And I think that when we talk about people of color, contemporary Jews in society today, unless they are indeed members of a community identified with people of color, tend to think of themselves as white. Are Jews white people in American context, Rachel?
I think Jews can pretend to be white people, and Jews can be seen as white people, often in ways that benefits them. I still believe there's a distinction. The synagogue that I serve as a rabbi had swastikas on its front door in 2017. That was a stark reminder that in the center of New York City, a bastion of liberalism, that there are people that hate us because we are different. So are we white, which has been seen as the ultimate dominant class? I don't think we are white. However, we can blend much better. When I'm walking on the street, unless you see my kippah, you don't know I'm Jewish. You don't know what that means. So I come with an advantage, and I am well aware of that. But as Jews, we need to be aware that there's a lot of people in this world that don't like us because of our beliefs and our background and our heritage, and we need to be proudly and unapologetically Jewish.
And that certainly gives us a lot in common with other people who've been disenfranchised in the way that you were talking about. So let me ask you then, there are foundational values that we shouldn't be so proud of. What are one or two of those that hold us back from making the progress that is so necessary?
Well, I think the sense that the value that if you work hard, you will succeed. And we have used that as an excuse for why people don't get to where we think they can go. And what we start doing is saying it's a failing of character as opposed to a failing of circumstance. And we need to go deeper and say, what weren't they given? Now, we don't need to make excuses for people. There are plenty of people in this world who choose not to work hard, who don't succeed. But I think for too long and too often, we convinced ourselves that hard work is the only thing that you need. To me, it's actually similar to marriage. If a marriage fails, you might say, well, they fell out of love with each other. I don't think things are so simple. Marriage takes work. Life takes work. Hard work takes work. You need to understand what's going on. You need the foundations of love. You need the foundations of hard work, and you need to understand the context in which you live.
Very nice. Most of our constitutional guarantees emphasize our commonality. But the first freedom in the Bill of Rights is a very personal freedom. It is religion, freedom of conscience. What are the values that are rooted in your personal belief system that you would commend to those who don't necessarily share those beliefs? What are the things that your Jewish faith commitments bring to the American purpose?
I would say there are two. And of course, being Jewish means that much of our sacred scriptures are in fact shared by other faith traditions as well. But I'll still speak to it uniquely as a Jewish person. The idea that in the Torah, the phrase, "we were strangers, so we shall treat the stranger well," is used 36 times, double high. The idea that twice with life we should welcome the stranger, that we know what it means to be victims. We know what it means to be enslaved. And when we became free, when we reached the promised land, we couldn't forget that foundational story. So treating the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, archetypes for the most vulnerable in our society, is something that we have to do. So I certainly hold that up. And the second teaching that I always share when teaching groups about what is Judaism is Hillel's famous statement, Rabbi Hillel's famous statement, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, what am I?" We need to live with two sides of the same coin. It's okay to have a particular identity. We don't need to apologize for that. We need to look out for ourselves if we feel we are being attacked, as I shared earlier, the swastika on our door. But if we only look at that and we don't understand the pain of others, then we've also missed the point of what it means to be Jewish. So we can be proudly Jewish and proudly American.
I had a civil rights leader say to me once, the person who does not vote his self-interests is a fool. The person who only votes his self-interests is a scoundrel, which I thought was a nice reframing of that teaching from Hillel that you mentioned. So, Rachel, tell me, how should our society pursue our national purpose? What advice can you give to us as a society to make sure we get where we ought to be going?
So it might sound simple, but I think it comes down to relationships. You can't write in 240 characters. It can't be only blasted on social media. It can't only be in one-way audio recording. We need to have conversations with people with whom we agree, so we know who our allies and alliances are, and with people that we disagree, and see where are those moments of connection, where are there red lines, and say, I can't be in an alliance with you because of what you believe. It's just too far for me. But we need to understand who is sitting in our table and in our community. And I've proudly been doing that in the interfaith work that I do. And I know that it makes a difference because when my community's been in pain and when others have been in pain, we show up for each other. And the only way we're going to make this vast country, which has so many different opinions, feel united is by getting to know the people with whom we share a shared purpose.
It's ironic we're having a conversation like this about relationships in the middle of this pandemic craziness that we've been a part of for many months now. We're coming up on a year where we've been so isolated from each other at a very divisive moment in American history. So how do we overcome the physical distance that we have to keep between us if we're going to survive to bridge that gap?
So I actually just today heard a great statement. The opposite of virtual is not real. The opposite of virtual is physical. And so the idea is we can create real relationships using virtual methods. So whether it's conversations like this, whether it is reading books together or sharing other experiences and then coming together. We don't need to physically be in the same room. Is that an ideal? Sure, of course. But that's never going to happen again. And what we've learned through this pandemic, I hate to use the phrase silver linings, but how can I not? The silver lining is that there's a way to expand our circle much more deeply than we ever could have imagined. If necessity is the mother of invention, we've learned over the past year that we can have an innovative spirit where we hold on to that which is real, that which is foundational, whether as Jews or as Americans, and expand our reach in a much greater way.
So having the vehicle to do that, as you and I obviously do here, and being able to have this conversation virtually rather than physically is part of that. I will tell you one of the most wonderful stories I've heard about this pandemic came from my son-in-law, whose brother lives in Chicago. My son-in-law and his family and my grandchildren live in Richmond. In order to build a relationship between his brother and his daughter, he sent them both the same Lego set, and they got on Zoom together and they built the same Lego piece together. 2.5 hours they worked on it, which was great for my granddaughter. It was great for my son-in-law's brother, and it was especially great for my daughter and son-in-law because their daughter was being occupied for 2.5 hours.
Right. Well, we talk about these Netflix watch parties, that there's ways of doing things together, even if you're not physically in the same space, and then having conversations. I can share that just recently, our congregation wanted to do something on Martin Luther King Day to think about issues of food insecurity. So we had dozens of families, each in their own kitchen, baking lasagna. One of our members is a caterer. He taught everybody how to make an easy lasagna. Everybody was in their own kitchen baking lasagna. We studied text around justice together. And then we went out and delivered the lasagnas. One person is delivering them to community fridges.
It's great. It's wonderful. Well, you've sort of answered what my next question is, which is what role does the individual play in pursuing our national purpose? What can we as individual people, rather than part of a much larger collective, do to move our national purpose forward?
Well, I think it is the individual does have a role, and it starts with what is an individual's purpose. So if we're going to start with national purpose, which is a conversation I think leaders should be having, then the role of each of those leaders is to go to their faith communities or leaders, governmental leaders, to go to their constituency and say, how are you going to make a difference? What small steps are you going to take? How are we going to make things better? I think that for a long time, America was built on the notion of the rugged individual without necessarily understanding the communal needs, which as a member of the Jewish people could be seen at odds. We know that in Jewish tradition, you need a community to fulfill so many commandments, whether it's the way we mourn, M-O-U-R-N, the way we celebrate holidays. We do that in community. But the only way to do that is by each individual showing up. And so I think it's the same thing. As if we are looking for a shared national purpose, then we need to know, what are we each going to commit to?
Very nice. Are you optimistic about America's future?
I am. It's been a hard few years, but I am. I'm an optimism at heart. I do believe that things will get better. And the example I will give, because on so many of our minds, is the issue of racial justice. Over Martin Luther King Day weekend, my family, I have 2 sons, a 7th and a 10th grader, and my husband and I watched Selma. We felt it was an important movie to watch to mark that weekend. And the whole focus, of course, of the march in 1965 was on voting rights. And we were able to make a direct connection from what happened in the 60s to what happened over the past few years in Georgia, and to see the role of registering voters and what happens when people can have ownership and a sense of shared destiny for their own decisions. So whether you're a Republican or a Democrat is actually not the issue. It's what does it mean when our country can enable more people to have a voice? And we're seeing that happen. And I celebrate that. I celebrate the amount of people that were involved in our election. I'm appalled by the amount of people that didn't see it as valid, but I still celebrate the amount of people that participate. And to me, that is a good signal for where America's going.
You know, it's an interesting thing that you chose to watch Selma and the events of 1965. Here we are in 2021. It's more than 55 years since that event took place. And we as Americans are notoriously impatient people. We like things resolved in 48 minutes of an hour plus commercials. So it's a good reminder to us that sometimes our best intentions and our cause for optimism is something that isn't immediately gratifying. I appreciate your lifting that up a little bit. We've reached the end of our time, and I'm very appreciative that you took this time in the midst of everything that's going on to have this conversation with me. And I want to offer thanks to you, our listeners, for engaging with us in exploring the American purpose. It's been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with Rabbi Rachel Ain, who has shared her perspective so generously. You can listen to this and other episodes of American Purpose at AmericanPurpose.org and learn more about our work at InterfaithAlliance.org and StateOfBelief.com. Interfaith Alliance has produced this program under the guidance of Ray Kirstein. I am Jack Moline, encouraging you to live with purpose.